The bedroom was bathed in the soft amber glow of a single bedside lamp. Margaret sighed, pulling the thin duvet higher over her chest. Beside her, Richard lay on his back, breathing slow and steady, eyes already closed. "Darling, are you still awake?" she whispered, giving his shoulder a gentle nudge. Richard grunted, voice thick with sleep. He did not turn. "Are we still able to, Margaret asked, keeping her tone light, almost playful. Richard rolled onto his side, presenting her with the broad slope of his back. "I am knackered, love. Early start tomorrow golf with the lads from the club." Margaret stared at the ceiling, the familiar hollow ache settling behind her ribs. For nearly 18 months, now their nights had followed the same pattern, a perfunctory kiss, a few half-hearted caresses. Then one of them would murmur an excuse, and the moment would slip away. At 53, she still turned heads when she walked into a room, but lately she wondered whether the heads that turned belonged only to strangers. Richard, 61 and comfortably retired, seemed content to let desire fade into habit. She slipped out of bed, bare feet silent on the thick carpet. The silk nightgown whispered against her thighs as she crossed to the French doors and stepped onto the small balcony. Oxfordshire lay quiet under a late spring moon. The scent of cut grass and distant lilac drifted up from the garden. Below, in the gravel drive, Daniel's sleek black Audi was parked neatly beside the roses. Daniel, her daughter, Claire's husband of 4 years, and Claire had arrived that afternoon for the long weekend. Tomorrow they would all drive down to the Dorset coast for 5 days in a rented seaside cottage. Margaret's thoughts drifted to earlier that evening. She had worn the new emerald green sundress, the one with the low crossover neckline she would bought on impulse in London. When she would bend to refill the water jug at dinner, she had felt Daniel's gaze linger longer than polite interest, longer than the casual glance a son-in-law ought to give his mother-in-law. The look had carried heat, curiosity, something unguarded. She had straightened quickly, cheeks warm, and told herself it was imagination. Yet the memory refused to fade. Across the landing, in the guest room, Daniel lay awake beside Claire. His wife slept deeply, one arm flung across his chest, her breathing soft and even. He stared at the ceiling beams, trying to will his pulse to slow. The image of Margaret in that green dress kept replaying. The way the silk had clung to the gentle swell of her hips, the faint shadow between her breasts when she leaned forward. She was 53, yet she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had lived enough to know exactly what she wanted and what she no longer needed to apologize for. Claire was beautiful, 28 and vibrant, all long limbs and easy laughter. But Margaret was something else entirely, ripe, composed, a slow-burning fire beneath perfect manners. Daniel clenched his jaw. "She is your mother-in-law. Get a grip." Thirsty, restless, he slid out of bed and padded barefoot down the corridor toward the kitchen. The house was old, full of creaking floorboards and the faint smell of beeswax polish. As he passed the sitting room, he froze. A figure sat in the darkness near the open window, moonlight silvering her hair. "Who is there?" he asked quietly. Daniel, Margaret's voice, low and surprised. "Could not sleep either." He hesitated, then stepped inside. She was curled in the big wingback chair, a glass of water cradled in both hands. The moonlight carved soft hollows beneath her cheekbones, smoothed years from her face. She wore the same silk nightgown he had glimpsed earlier, its hem riding modestly above her knees. "Just needed a drink," he said, suddenly aware of his t-shirt and boxer shorts. "Come and sit." She patted the ottoman beside her chair. "I won't bite." He sat, elbows on his knees, keeping a careful distance. Her perfume reached him something warm, spiced, nothing like Claire's light floral scent. Adult. Dangerous. Excited about Dorset? She asked, tilting her head. Yeah. It has been ages since we all went away together. Me too. She gave a small, wistful smile. Sometimes I feel as though life has shrunk to these four walls. Same routines, same conversations. I used to love surprises. Daniel swallowed. You still could. Her gaze met his, steady and searching. Do you think so? Silence stretched between them, fragile and electric. Outside, an owl called once, sharp and lonely. You were looking at me tonight, she said softly. At dinner. I noticed. Heat crawled up his neck. Sorry. I did not mean to. Do not apologize. The corner of her mouth curved. It is rather flattering, actually. It has been a long time since anyone looked at me that way. He did not know what to say. His heart hammered against his ribs. Margaret set the glass on the side table and leaned forward slightly. The neckline of her nightgown shifted. He forced his eyes to stay on her face. I am not imagining it, am I? She murmured. No, he admitted, voice rough. You are not. For a moment neither moved. Then she reached out and brushed the back of her fingers along his forearm, light, deliberate. The touch sent a jolt through him, sharp and undeniable. Go back to bed, Daniel, she said, standing. We have got an early start tomorrow. As she passed him, her hip brushed his shoulder. He smelled her perfume again, felt the warmth of her body. She paused at the doorway. Sleep well, she whispered. Then she was gone. Daniel sat in the dark for a long time, pulse racing, mind reeling. He told himself it was nothing, just a moment, a glance, a touch that could be explained away. But deep down he knew better. Something had shifted tonight, and once shifted, it would not easily shift back. The next morning the house buzzed with preparation. Claire darted between rooms, checking lists on her phone. Richard fussed over the ancient Range Rover, muttering about oil levels and tire pressure. Margaret and Daniel ended up in the kitchen, packing the cool box with sandwiches, fruit, and bottles of chilled white wine. Pass me the blue bag on the top shelf, would you? Margaret asked. He reached up. Their fingers brushed as he handed it down. Both of them froze for a split second. Her skin was warm, soft. Neither pulled away immediately. Thank you, she said, eyes locked on his. No problem, he managed. From the hallway, Claire's voice floated in. Mum, where did you put the sun hats? In the hall cupboard, darling, Margaret called back, then turned to Daniel again, voice dropping. This trip is going to be lovely, do not you think? There was something in her tone, invitation, promise, warning that made his stomach tighten. Yeah, he said. I think it will. They loaded the car, everyone laughing and teasing one another. Richard took the wheel first, Margaret beside him. Claire and Daniel sat in the back. As the Range Rover pulled out of the drive and turned toward the road south, the countryside rolled past in soft greens and golds. Daniel stared out the window, trying to focus on the fields, the hedgerows, anything but the woman in the front passenger seat. But every so often Margaret would glance at the rear-view mirror, and when their eyes met, she did not look away. The Range Rover humped steadily along the A354, cutting south through rolling Wiltshire hills toward the Dorset coast. Richard kept both hands on the wheel, humming an old Cliff Richard tune under his breath. Margaret sat beside him, sunglasses perched on her nose, one elbow resting on the open window, so the warm breeze lifted strands of her silver-streaked auburn hair. In the back, Claire had already dozed off, head lolling against the window, AirPods in. Daniel pretended to scroll through his phone, but his eyes kept drifting to the front passenger seat, specifically to the curve of Margaret's shoulder, the way her linen blouse had slipped slightly to reveal the thin strap of her camisole beneath. After about 40 minutes, Richard yawned loudly. Bloody hell. My eyes are getting heavy. Daniel, fancy taking over for a stretch? Daniel straightened. Sure, happy to. Richard pulled into a lay by beside a field of bright yellow rapeseed. They swapped places with the usual good-natured grumbling. Once settled, Daniel adjusted the seat back, checked the mirrors, and eased the big car back onto the road. Margaret remained in the passenger seat, legs crossed, the hem of her navy skirt riding just above her knee. You drive smoothly, she remarked after a few silent miles. Her voice was quiet, meant only for him. Thanks. Years of London traffic, I suppose. She turned her head slightly, studying his profile. Strong hands, too. Not like Richard's these days, knuckles all knobbly and stiff. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. He did not reply. Behind them, Claire's breathing stayed deep and even. Richard had already tilted his seat and closed his eyes, mouth slightly open. The only sounds were the low thrum of the engine and the occasional rush of an overtaking lorry. Margaret shifted, uncrossing and recrossing her legs. The movement drew the fabric higher. Daniel's eyes flicked down for half a second before he forced them back to the road. You have been quiet today, she said. Just concentrating. On the road. Or on something else. He swallowed. Both, maybe. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. I thought so. Her right hand moved slowly, casually, and settled on the gear knob, right beside his own hand on the shifter. Their little fingers were less than an inch apart. Neither moved to close the gap, yet neither withdrew. Does it bother you? She asked after another mile. That I notice the way you look at me? Yes, he admitted. And no. Honest answer. She let her pinky brush his knuckle, the barest contact. I like honest. Daniel's pulse thudded in his throat. Margaret. Shoo. She glanced quickly over her shoulder, confirming the others were still asleep. They won't wake. Richard sleeps like the dead in a moving car, and Claire's out for at least another hour. Her hand slid up until her palm covered the back of his. Warm. Steady. Deliberate. Pull over when you see the next services, she murmured. I could use some air. He nodded once, mouth dry. 10 minutes later, he indicated and eased the Range Rover into the forecourt of a roadside service station. He parked at the far end, away from the petrol pumps and the cluster of cars near the entrance. Richard stirred but did not open his eyes. Claire remained asleep. Margaret unclipped her seatbelt. Come. A quick walk. They stepped out into the warm afternoon. A light breeze carried the smell of cut grass and diesel. Margaret walked ahead toward a low wooden fence that separated the car park from a small meadow. Daniel followed, heart hammering. When they reached the fence, she turned, leaning back against the top rail, so her blouse pulled taut across her chest. Better, she said. I was starting to feel confined. He stopped a meter away. We should not be doing this. Doing what? She asked innocently, taking a breath of fresh air. You know what I mean. She studied him for a long moment. Tell me to go back to the car, Daniel. Tell me you want none of this. I will walk away right now, and we will never speak of it again. He opened his mouth. No words came. Instead, he took one step closer. Margaret's eyes darkened. That is what I thought. She reached out, fingers curling lightly into the front of his polo shirt, tugging him the last half-meter. Their bodies did not quite touch, yet the heat between them felt solid. "I have spent 25 years being the perfect wife," she whispered. "The perfect mother. The perfect hostess. I have forgotten what it feels like to be wanted. Really wanted. Not tolerated. Not endured. Wanted." Daniel's voice was rough. "I want you." The admission hung between them, raw and dangerous. She rose onto her toes and kissed him soft at first, exploratory, then deeper when he responded. Her hands slid up to cradle his face. His settled at her waist, pulling her flush against him. The kiss tasted of mint and sunlight and something darker recklessness, perhaps. They broke apart when a distant car door slammed. Margaret's breathing was unsteady. "We can't not hear." "I know. But tonight." She let the sentence drift, eyes locked on his. "The cottage has 2 separate bedrooms upstairs. Richard snores terribly after wine. I will say I need the single room so I can read without disturbing him. Claire will understand, she always does." Daniel's mind spun. And if he notices? He won't. He has not noticed much of anything for years. She touched his cheek. "The back door leads to the garden. There's a path down to the beach. After midnight, when they are both asleep." She did not finish. She did not need to. They walked back to the car in silence. When they climbed inside, Richard grumbled something about needing the loo and shuffled off toward the services. Claire stirred, blinked, and smiled sleepily. "Everything okay?" she mumbled. "Fine, darling," Margaret said brightly, smoothing her skirt. "Just needed to stretch our legs." Daniel started the engine again. As they pulled back onto the motorway, the sun was lower now, painting the hills in gold. Margaret glanced at him in the rear view mirror, once brief, secret, searing. The rest of the drive passed in a strange, suspended tension. Conversation flowed normally, Claire talking about work, Richard recounting an old golf story, Margaret laughing at the right moments. But beneath it all, Daniel felt the pull, steady and inexorable, like gravity. By late afternoon, they reached the coastal road. The sea appeared suddenly on the right slate blue, and restless under a sky streaked with pink. The cottage sat perched above a pebbled cove, whitewashed walls glowing in the late light. They unloaded bags, opened windows to air out the salt-scented rooms, uncorked a bottle of rose. Everything felt ordinary, domestic, safe. Yet when Margaret passed Daniel in the narrow hallway carrying a box of groceries, her fingers trailed deliberately along his wrist. "Tonight," she mouthed, soundless. He nodded once, barely perceptible. Dinner was laughter and grilled sea bass, and too much wine. Richard fell asleep in the armchair by 9:30, snoring softly. Claire yawned and kissed her mother goodnight, then tugged Daniel toward their bedroom. "I am shattered," she said, already pulling her dress over her head. "Coming. In a minute. Just going to lock up." She smiled, sleepy and trusting, and disappeared into the bathroom. Daniel stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the dark garden. The path to the beach was just visible, silvered by moonlight. He waited until the house went quiet. Then he waited 10 minutes more. At 11:47, he slipped out the back door. The night air was cool and briny. Margaret was already there, waiting at the edge of the lawn in a long cardigan over her nightdress, hair loose. She did not speak. She simply took his hand and led him down the path toward the sound of waves. The pebbles crunched softly under their bare feet as Margaret led Daniel down the narrow path. Moonlight turned the sea into a sheet of hammered silver. Small waves sighed against the shore, regular as breathing. Neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary now. Almost dangerous, anything said aloud might shatter the fragile spell they had woven around themselves. At the bottom of the path the beach opened out, a crescent of pale stones framed by dark cliffs. Margaret stopped where the tide line had left a fringe of seaweed and broken shells. She let go of his hand, turned to face him. The cardigan slipped from her shoulders and fell to the ground. Beneath it she wore only a thin cotton nightdress, the kind that had once been modest but now, in the salt air, clung and shifted with every breath. "I have not done this in years," she said quietly. "Not like this. Not wanting it so much it hurts." Daniel stepped closer, then let it hurt. He cupped her face with both hands and kissed her slowly this time, learning the shape of her mouth, the faint taste of wine still on her tongue. She sighed against him, fingers threading into his hair, pulling him down. When they parted she was trembling, though whether from cold or anticipation, he could not tell. They moved together toward a flat shelf of rock that the high tide had smoothed over decades. Margaret sat first, drawing her knees up, then patted the space beside her. Daniel settled close enough that their thighs touched. For a long moment they simply looked at the water, listening to the sea rearrange the stones. "I used to come here as a girl," she said eventually. "Every summer. I would sit on this very rock and imagine the life I would have. Husband, children, a house that always smelled of lavender and clean linen. I got almost everything I imagined." "Almost," he echoed. She gave a small, rueful laugh. "Richard was never cruel, never unfaithful. He simply stopped seeing me, stopped wanting me. One day I looked across the breakfast table and realized I was living with a polite stranger." Daniel reached for her hand, laced their fingers together. "I see you. I know." She turned to him, eyes shining in the moonlight. "That is why I am here. Because for the first time in 25 years someone looks at me and sees a woman, not a wife, not a mother, just a woman who still wants." He kissed her again, deeper this time. She rose onto her knees, straddling his lap, the nightdress riding up her thighs. His hands found the small of her back, then slid higher, tracing the knobs of her spine through the thin cotton. She arched into the touch, breath catching. They undressed each other without hurry. Her nightdress whispered over her head and landed on the rock beside the cardigan. His shirt followed, then the rest. The night air was cool against bare skin, but the heat between them burned it away. Margaret's body was softer than Claire's, more generous, marked by time in ways that only made her more real faint silver lines across her stomach from carrying a child, the gentle curve of hips that had cradled life. Daniel kissed every inch he could reach, reverent, hungry. When he entered her, she gasped, fingers digging into his shoulders. They moved together slowly at first, finding a rhythm that matched the lazy pulse of the tide. Then faster, more urgent, until the only sounds of their breathing, the soft slap of skin, the distant murmur of waves. Afterward they lay tangled on the cardigan, her head on his chest, his arm around her waist. The moon had moved higher. The cliffs threw long shadows across the beach. "We can't keep doing this," Daniel said after a while, voice low. "I know." Margaret traced idle circles on his skin. "But we will. At least for the next few days. Then we go home and pretend none of it happened." He tightened his arm around her. "Can you pretend?" She was quiet for so long, he thought she would not answer. Then no. "But I will try." For Claire's sake. For the life we have already built. They dressed in silence. Before they climbed the path back to the cottage, she stopped him once more, kissed him with something close to desperation. Tomorrow night, she whispered against his mouth. Same time, same place. He nodded. They slipped into the house, separately. Margaret first, through the back door she had left unlatched. Daniel waited 10 minutes, heart still racing, before following. The kitchen was dark. Only the faint glow of the hallway nightlight guided him upstairs. In their bedroom, Claire was still asleep, curled on her side, oblivious. Daniel slid under the covers as carefully as possible. She murmured something incoherent and nestled closer. Guilt stabbed him sharp, sudden, almost nauseating. Yet beneath it burned something else, satisfaction, hunger, the knowledge that tomorrow night he would do it again. Morning arrived with bright sun and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. Breakfast was cheerful, ordinary. Richard fried eggs and bacon. Claire chattered about booking a boat trip to see the Jurassic Coast fossils. Margaret moved around the table in a loose linen shirt and shorts, hair pinned up, looking rested and radiant. When she leaned across Daniel to pour more orange juice, her breast brushed his shoulder. She lingered a fraction too long. He felt the heat of her body, smelled the faint trace of sea salt still clinging to her skin. Their eyes met. She smiled small, secret, devastating. "Thank you, darling," she said to everyone and no one in particular, then carried the jug back to the counter. The day passed in a haze of normalcy, walking the coastal path, eating fish and chips on the harbor wall, laughing at Richard's terrible jokes. But every glance Margaret sent Daniel carried weight. Every accidental brush of fingers promised more. That evening, after dinner, after Richard had fallen asleep in front of the television with a half-finished crossword on his lap, after Claire had kissed her mother goodnight and disappeared upstairs, Margaret paused in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Daniel across the room. He looked back. Neither spoke. At 11:50, he slipped out the back door, again. She was already waiting on the path, barefoot, nightdress fluttering in the breeze. This time they did not bother with words. They simply walked down to the beach, hand in hand, knowing exactly what they would find there and what they would lose when the holiday ended.